Queen Elizabeth II of the UK and Commonwealth realms has died after a reign of 70 years 214 days. Her Majesty passed away at her Balmoral estate in Scotland on the afternoon of September 8, 2022 at the age of 96, after her family had been called to her bedside due to her deterioration of health and were with her when she died. Her son Charles is now king, and his wife Camilla has officially been called Queen Consort by the palace. They will remain at Balmoral tonight and return to London in the morning, where the Ascension Council will declare him king and announce his regal name. Elizabeth was the longest reigning monarch in British history and lived at the center of many significant events of the last century, as her life spanned a world war, the end of the British Empire, 14 British prime ministers, major social, political, and technological changes, and royal family upheavals. 4 out of 5 Britons were not alive before Elizabeth was queen, highlighting her remarkable life and era. Elizabeth was born on April 21, 1926, at the London home of her maternal grandparents. Her father, Prince Albert Duke of York, known as Bertie, was the second son of King George V, and her mother Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was the daughter of a minor Scottish aristocrat. After a difficult pregnancy, she had to be delivered by emergency caesarean section, a procedure far less common than it is today. Bertie wrote to a cousin that his newborn daughter was too delicious and a great joy to them both, noting that Elizabeth was progressing wonderfully well and flourishing. The baby princess was baptized at Buckingham Palace and named Elizabeth after her mother, Alexandra after King George V's mother who had died 6 months earlier, and Mary after her paternal grandmother who was queen consort at the time. She lived a quiet and happy life with her parents, who preferred to raise her in a flat in London rather than a royal palace. As a toddler she struggled to pronounce her own name and called herself Lilibet, a pet name that stayed within the family. She was especially adored by her grandfather King George V, whom she affectionately called Grandpa England. At 4, Lilibet was joined by her younger sister Margaret, who also arrived via caesarean section, and after 2 difficult deliveries the Duke and Duchess decided their family was complete with their 2 cherished daughters. There was little pressure for a male heir because it was assumed that Bertie's older brother Prince Edward would marry and pass the throne to his own sons. Even so, King George hinted at the future by remarking that he prayed his eldest son would never marry and have children and that nothing would come between Bertie and Lilibet on the throne. Elizabeth and Margaret were educated at home by their mother and governess, as aristocratic girls were not sent to school at the time. Although the Duchess's own education had ended at 13, she was bright, curious, and read voraciously, teaching her daughters history, language, literature, and music. Both girls were greatly doted on and were given a Pembroke Welsh corgi named Dookie, the first of many pet dogs Elizabeth would adore. Margaret inherited her mother's charm, spontaneity, and mischievous nature, while Elizabeth reflected a more reserved, shy, and formal royal temperament. Winston Churchill remarked that even at 2 she had an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant, and a cousin described her as a jolly little girl who was fundamentally sensible and well-behaved. She particularly resembled her paternal grandmother in appearance and temperament, as Queen Mary was more devoted to duty than to her children but proved a far better grandmother than mother. In January 1936, when Elizabeth was 9, her grandfather King George V died and her uncle became King Edward VIII. From the beginning, the new monarch refused to take his role seriously, even leaving secret government documents around his country house for guests to read. He was obsessed with an American, Wallis Simpson, who as a divorced woman would not be accepted as his wife and queen by the government, church, or the British people. Within a year of his ascension, he used his relationship with Wallis as a reason to give up the role he had always dreaded, abdicated the throne, left the country, and married her. He never consulted his younger brother Bertie about placing the crown on him, and when Bertie told his mother of the abdication, he broke down and sobbed like a child. A desperately shy man with a severe stutter, he feared he was unequal to the task, yet unlike his brother he possessed a strong sense of morality and duty and accepted the heavy mantle of monarchy, becoming King George VI. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey on May 12, 1937, the date originally intended for his brother's coronation, and young Elizabeth became the heir presumptive. Under the succession laws of the time, a future son would have displaced her in the line to the throne, so she was never officially heir apparent. For the same reason she was never made Princess of Wales, the traditional title of the heir apparent, and she was not made Princess Royal because her aunt Princess Mary already held that title, though within the family it was clear that the 10-year-old Elizabeth would one day be queen. In 1939, the royal family of 4 toured the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, where an 18-year-old cadet, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, was assigned to escort 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth and her younger sister. He was their third cousin through Queen Victoria and second cousin through King Christian IX of Denmark. Elizabeth was smitten, and the two began exchanging letters while he was sent to fight in World War II. Despite their initial hesitations, George VI and Elizabeth became an exceptional and popular king and queen during the war, touring the country, visiting bombed neighborhoods and munitions factories to raise morale. Queen Elizabeth was so admired that Hitler called her the most dangerous woman in Europe. The couple stayed in London even after Buckingham Palace was bombed and narrowly escaped with their lives. After a Nazi plot to kidnap Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret was uncovered, the Prime Minister suggested evacuating them to Canada, but their mother refused, saying the children would not go without her and she would not leave without the king. The king would never leave, but it was decided that the girls should be sent to the safer Windsor Castle, 25 miles outside London and close enough for their parents to visit on weekends. Elizabeth and Margaret stayed there for 5 years. The wartime castle, like much of the nation, felt dark and depressing, yet the princesses tried to lift spirits by staging Christmas pantomimes for local children and raising money for the Queen's Will Fund to make warm garments for soldiers. At 14, Elizabeth gave her first radio broadcast on BBC's Children's Hour, encouraging children to be brave during frightening air raids and evacuations. At 19, she joined the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service as a driver and mechanic. On May 8, 1945, the Nazis were defeated and the bloodiest war in human history ended. That night, teenage Elizabeth and Margaret were allowed to go out in London incognito and celebrate with the crowds, later recalling strangers linking arms and moving together in a tide of happiness and relief. During this time, Elizabeth had been corresponding with Philip, now a lieutenant and decorated war hero. Once back in the UK, their childhood friendship grew into a romance. Her parents were uneasy about the match. Philip was a prince without a country, descended from the exiled Greek royal family. Though raised mainly in the UK by his British grandmother, his sisters had grown up in Germany and 2 of his brothers-in-law were Nazis. In the summer of 1947, Philip asked the king for Elizabeth's hand. George agreed but delayed the announcement until her 21st birthday. Meanwhile, Philip renounced his Greek and Danish titles, converted to Anglicanism, and adopted the surname Mountbatten from his British relatives. To distract Elizabeth, the king and queen took her on a state visit to South Africa to promote unity amid rising racial tensions. During the tour, she delivered a speech pledging lifelong service to her people. The journey was exhausting and the unity effort failed. A year later, the Afrikaner Nationalist Party took power and established apartheid. Across the world, the British Empire was shrinking as colonies sought independence, and King George gracefully accepted the changing reality, relinquishing foreign imperial titles and proudly embracing the role of head of the Commonwealth. Elizabeth and Philip married at Westminster Abbey on November 20, 1947. Britain was still facing poverty and rationing, so the government recommended a modest ceremony. Elizabeth even bought the silk for her gown with ration coupons, but the public welcomed the wedding as a joyful moment after years of hardship. They honeymooned at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, bringing her corgi Susan, and then moved into Clarence House, the traditional London residence of the heir since King William IV. 6 days before their first anniversary, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, Charles, and King George issued letters patent allowing her children to use the titles of prince or princess, which they were not automatically entitled to through the female line. Philip, still a naval officer, was posted several times to Malta. The couple often left Charles with his grandparents and enjoyed some of the most carefree years of their marriage on the Mediterranean island, where Elizabeth lived more simply as a naval officer's wife, attending beach parties and dances. In 1950, their second child, Anne, was born. Meanwhile, King George's health declined due to lung cancer and stress, and Elizabeth gradually assumed more royal duties. These responsibilities kept her away from her children, and young Charles once failed to recognize his own mother. She later arranged for a nursery train car so Charles and could travel with her while she was in Britain. In 1952, the king was deemed too ill for a major Commonwealth tour, so Elizabeth and Philip went in his place. George waved goodbye at the airport, returned to Sandringham with Queen Elizabeth and Margaret, and died a few days later. In Kenya, the couple had just come back from a camping trip when Philip gently told Elizabeth the news. As the heir, she had already been queen for hours without knowing it. When asked her regnal name, she simply replied, Elizabeth, and thus became Elizabeth II, like the 16th-century queen of the same name, both beginning their reigns at 25. Some Scots objected to the title Elizabeth II since Scotland had not been united with England during the reign of the first Elizabeth, making her technically the first Queen Elizabeth of Scotland. She returned immediately to the UK for her father's funeral and to assume her duties. On June 2, 1953, she entered Westminster Abbey wearing ancient crown jewels and took the coronation oath in the first televised coronation, prompting many to buy their first televisions. Philip, now Prince Consort, helped organize the ceremony. Although some proposed the Mountbatten dynasty, Prime Minister Winston Churchill advised keeping the royal name Windsor, while Philip privately resented not being able to pass his surname to his children. Their marriage reflected 1950s conventions, and Philip struggled with his subordinate public role. Elizabeth allowed him greater authority over the children, and he was often strict with Charles, insisting he attend Gordonstown, a harsh boarding school in northern Scotland where he was unhappy and bullied. As a constitutional monarch, Elizabeth's name formally heads the government, but she cannot express political opinions publicly. Still, she remained active behind the scenes, reviewing daily red boxes of state papers and meeting the Prime Minister weekly to advise and warn when necessary. In 1957 and 1963, she had to appoint a Prime Minister because the Conservative Party lacked a formal leadership election system, leading to criticism and later reforms to keep the monarch above politics. After the coronation, Elizabeth and Philip undertook a 7-month Commonwealth tour, and she became the global face of the Commonwealth, visiting numerous countries in person during the Jet Age. She was head of state of 16 Commonwealth realms within the wider Commonwealth of Nations, a group of 53 former British colonies. Despite security fears, she visited Ghana in 1961, winning over the country and helping prevent closer Soviet influence in Africa. Her relationship with her sister Margaret remained close yet complicated. Margaret wished to marry Peter Townsend, a divorced man 16 years older, but as head of the Church of England, which opposed remarriage after divorce, Elizabeth repeatedly delayed approval until Margaret eventually gave him up. Margaret later married photographer Anthony Armstrong-Jones, made Earl of Snowdon, though their marriage was turbulent. Elizabeth often acted as a stabilizing, almost maternal presence for their children, David and Sarah. Elizabeth and Philip also faced strain in the late 1950s. In 1956, he toured abroad on the royal yacht Britannia and opened the Melbourne Olympics, sparking rumors of infidelity. By 1960, however, they had reconciled and welcomed Prince Andrew, followed by Prince Edward in 1964. In 1966, a mining disaster in Aberfan, Wales, killed 144 people, most of them children. Philip visited immediately, but the Queen delayed her visit for a week, fearing it might hinder recovery efforts. This hesitation was widely criticized and later became one of her greatest regrets. In 1969, Charles was formally invested as Prince of Wales at Caernarfon Castle. The 1970s and 80s were challenging for the monarchy, as economic recession led many Britons to question its relevance. The punk band Sex Pistols released God Save the Queen in 1977, a sharp criticism that became a major hit despite being banned on BBC Radio during her Silver Jubilee. In 1981, while riding during Trooping the Colour, Elizabeth was shot at 6 times at close range, and she was targeted again in New Zealand later that year. In 1982, an intruder even entered her bedroom at Buckingham Palace, and after calmly speaking with him, she called security. Meanwhile, Prince Charles had long maintained a relationship with Camilla, though the royal family considered her an unsuitable bride. She married Andrew Parker Bowles under pressure, yet she and Charles continued their on-and-off affair even after he married Diana Spencer, a shy and beautiful figure seen as a fairy tale princess. The public initially overlooked the unhappiness of their marriage, but Charles's distance and renewed relationship with Camilla deepened the strain. The Queen showed limited sympathy for Diana, unable to fully relate to the pressures of moving from private life into constant royal duty and scrutiny. Diana's popularity for her glamour and charity work grew, and as the marriage collapsed, Charles and Camilla were widely blamed. The year 1992 proved especially difficult. Princess Anne's husband, Mark Phillips, was revealed to have fathered a child with another woman, and Anne's private letters were published. Prince Andrew's marriage to Sarah Ferguson also broke down amid long separations during his naval service, something the Queen struggled to sympathize with because her own naval wife years had been happy. After scandalous photographs of Sarah appeared, the marriage soon ended. The Queen later called 1992 her annus horribilis, as Windsor Castle also suffered a major fire, and public anger rose when taxpayers were expected to fund repairs while she paid no income tax. She eventually agreed to pay income tax and personally cover allowances for minor royals, though debates over royal wealth and public funding continued. In 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris while being chased by paparazzi. Elizabeth was at Balmoral with her grandsons William and Harry and focused on supporting them in their grief. However, her initial public silence during the global mourning was widely seen as cold and out of touch. In 2002, she marked her Golden Jubilee, celebrating 50 years on the throne, but later that year she lost both her mother, aged 101, and her sister Margaret at 71. In 2005, Charles finally married Camilla. His eldest son William later married Catherine Middleton, and their widely admired wedding helped restore public goodwill toward the monarchy. Shortly before their first child was born, succession laws were changed from male preference primogeniture to absolute primogeniture, giving daughters equal status with sons. Prince Andrew later faced serious criticism over his association with Jeffrey Epstein and allegations involving an underage girl, leading him to withdraw from public duties and relinquish patronages. Prince Harry and his wife Meghan Markle also stepped back as senior royals, and their interview with Oprah Winfrey praised the Queen while accusing unnamed royals of racism and neglect of Meghan's mental health. On April 9, 2021, Prince Philip, Elizabeth's husband of 73 years, died just short of his 100th birthday and was buried at Windsor Castle. Despite numerous royal scandals, the elderly Queen remained widely respected. Known for her formality, humor, and brightly colored outfits with matching hats inspired by her mother's advice to remain visible in crowds, she celebrated her Platinum Jubilee in 2022, marking 70 years on the throne. Queen Elizabeth died peacefully on September 8, 2022, surrounded by family, and the United Kingdom and Commonwealth realms then had a new king.